Hello class and welcome back. Thank you all for joining me again. Again, my name is Professor Ramirez. Today we're going to be discussing chapter 13 from your book. It's going to be an overview of Article 2. Now what Article 2 generally is, it's going to apply to contracts for the sale of goods. And that's what Article 2 is going to be discussing. We'll be discussing sales in two parts in this week and next week, but this is generally going to be an overview of Article 2. So let's go on to the next slides. Hopefully this won't be a long video, but it'll be enough just to give you the quick overview of Article 2. Well, let's go on to the next slide so we can jump on this. Now we're jumping on to slide number 2, the chapter learning objectives. So after studying this chapter, y'all should be able to know at least five points of materials, or 5 points. The first one is you're going to be able to identify which types of contracts are governed by Article 2 of the UCC. Second, we're going to be able to articulate the fundamental purpose of the UCC Article 2 in commercial transactions. And number 3, you're going to be able to explain what a default rule is and how default rules help fill the gaps in contracts. And the last one, number 4, you're going to be able to define goods and merchants under Article 2. And the fifth and last one, we're going to be able to distinguish between common law contracts and the UCC contracts. So we're going to be able to differentiate between those two. So those are the learning objectives. So hopefully when we finish this video, at least those 5 points, you'll be able to discuss at least some talking points on all those five points and have some material to back that up. But if you don't, also follow along with the PowerPoint and as well as read chapter 13 to make this conversation smoothly as possible. All right, well, let's go on to the next slide so we can discuss a little bit more. Now discussing here slide number 3, the introduction to the UCC. Now the UCC stands for the Uniform Commercial Code, and it's a model statute that's published by the National Conference of Commissioners of Uniform State Laws, the NCCUSL. Now basically every state in the US has adopted all or substantially all of the provisions of the laws or the rules of the UCC. Now we'll just call the UCC, we'll just call it the code. But the code Article 2 is generally going to apply to what we're talking about here. Article 2 is going to cover contracts for the sale of goods, and Article 2A is going to cover for the laws of leasing of goods. Now the UCC contains 11 articles in them. However, for purposes of this video, because it's a large amount of material to cover, but we're going to discuss only Article 2 of the code, Article 2 of 11. Article 2 again covers the contracts for the sale of goods, and Article 2A covers the leasing of goods. But of those 2 of 11, that's already a lot of material to cover with. But if you're ever interested, you look at Google or the Uniform Commercial Code, and you'll see all those 11 other articles that are covered in the code. But let's go to the next slide and discuss a little bit more about Article 2. Now hopping on here to slide number 4, the purpose of Article 2 in the UCC or in the code. Now the underlying policy goal of Article 2 of the UCC is to promote commercial efficiency and the completion of business transactions. Now the UCC, or Article 2 of the code, now that's going to facilitate business transactions by providing, or at least attempting to provide a simple and standardized procedures that merchants, which are wholesalers or sellers, and consumers may rely on in cases of issues arising or unforeseen contingencies. Now these simple and standardized rules and procedures are also called the default rules of the code. Now in the default rules, we'll discuss in the next slide, but these default rules, these are meant to simplify and standardize the procedures for those merchants and consumers when they're selling consumer goods. But let's go to the next slide and discuss a little bit more about what these default rules are for the code. Now jumping on here to slide number 5, the default rules of the code of Article 2 of the code. Now a default rule is going to be a rule of law designed to fill in the gaps in business contracts, specifically for the business contract for the sale of goods. Now it's going to fill in the gap for unexpected or unforeseen circumstances that might occur after a deal is already signed or after the agreement has already been signed. Now default rules like the rules in Article 2 of the UCC or of the code, they're going to help courts resolve problems that were obviously not anticipated or not addressed by the parties when they made their deal. Now, a default rule, again, just think about it. It fills in the gaps when individuals sign a contract. Anybody, whether it's attorneys or individuals doing it themselves, you're going to write as much as you think you need in the contract. You think everything is covered, but sometimes there's situations that arise that we didn't anticipate, we didn't think about. Maybe some recent examples is when the pandemic happened, when COVID came, all the government shutdowns. There's individuals who did not think about writing. What if there's a huge pandemic that takes, that's all over the world and forces my business to shut down? I mean, they weren't thinking about those type of things when writing contracts. So the UCC already has default rules for when things like that happen. So usually when there's the contract or the agreement is silent in certain terms, then the UCC has all the rules already to fill in those gaps of situations that the parties were just unaware of, or they didn't anticipate, or they had no idea that was even something that they needed to write in the contract. The UCC already has the default rules used to fill in the gaps when the contract is say incomplete. They'll fill in the gaps. Now these default rules can be modified by the parties. Of course, these default rules are just meant to fill in the gaps when the contract is silent in a certain situation that maybe arises later in time. However, if the default rule applies, because there's nothing in the contract mentioning that, however, the parties may modify the default rule in agreement. Now, these default rules are just there to help the courts when people write a contract. Usually they write, I'm going to sell this amount or this widget for $5. And I'll deliver to you in 5 days. And they think, oh yeah, boom, that's great. That's a contract, 4 or 5 sentences. Now, obviously, we know that's not a complete contract. There's a lot of things that go into the contract, but the UCC already helps individuals for the sale of goods to fill in those gaps. And that's what the courts will use if the contracts were silent, or if the contract didn't mention anything about a certain situation. The default rules are going to apply for those terms that were not mentioned. Well, let's go on the next slide and talk a little bit more about the default rules. Now getting on here to slide number 6. So this is the second slide for the default rules. I know I mentioned some of this a little while ago, but I just want to make sure that this sticks with everybody. So the default rules, they're going to be generally gaps. They're going to be risks or circumstances that aren't specified or addressed in the contract. So every contract, there's no such thing as a perfect contract. So every contract will have some gaps or a gap that perhaps maybe the attorneys or somebody, of course, didn't mention or put in there, because no one can predict every single thing and can see every single situation that may arise in the future. Now, we mentioned these default rules. These rules are going to be applied by the courts to fill in those gaps that an individual or that a company or that the contract has. Now, these gaps are going to be filled in by default rules. Now, the UCC, as we mentioned, this generally, they're going to come into play when the parties have not expressly agreed into a certain term, meaning a situation arises. How do we handle that situation? The UCC will already have default rules. The default rules are going to be, they're going to fill in the gaps otherwise when a contract would be incomplete. Say one example in a contract can be, say there is a wholesaler selling tennis balls to a retailer, a tennis ball shop who buys them. The retailer orders 1,000 tennis balls for $1 each. 1,000 A tennis balls of specific A. So then for $1,000 a ball, so the retailer owes the wholesaler $1,000 for each $1 for each ball. And say the wholesaler, something happened, the government shut them down, or a machine broke down, so they shipped 1,000 of B balls to the retailer, but the retailer didn't. There was nothing in the contract that mentioned that. All they said, I will pay you I'll pay you $1,000 for 1,000 A tennis balls to be delivered in 5 days. That's all the contract says. What if the wholesaler delivered the wrong type of balls? What if the wholesaler delivered 500 of the correct balls and accidentally delivered 500 of the other balls? But the contract didn't mention what would happen to the parties' payment or anything like that if this were to happen. Then the UCC, which the default the rules will actually cover later in another video, but for those situations that arise, that sometimes individuals or businesses they don't think about covering every single in the contract. That's what the default rules is going to apply to when certain situations happen. And what I mean by situation, I hate to use this word, but it's basically when problems arise. When problems come about of the contract, they look at the contract and it's a one-page contract. They're going to say, well, what do we do now? Whose fault it is? What are the damages? Who's going to pay for this? Then we look at the UCC laws, the default rules, because it wasn't mentioned in the contract. So that's what they're generally there for when problems arise, there needs to be some guidance on what the parties need to do. Okay, well, let's go on the next slide and keep talking about this. Now, slide number 7, what are the UCC, the coverage and the definitions. Now, the code Article 2 applies to agreements for the sale of goods. Now, just to define what are goods are going to have two terms to meet. Goods, they're going to refer to property that is tangible, basically that it's physically it's a physical product like a laptop or perhaps maybe a shoe, something that is tangible physically there, and perhaps and it's movable. So it can be shipped, say for instance, like I mentioned, shoes, a laptop, something like that. So it has to be tangible and it has to be movable from place to place. The product or the good is able to be shipped or moved or perhaps maybe sold and picked up by the customer and moved. And one of the two main contracts that specifically they're not covered because they do not fit the tangible and movable definition is going to be real estate contracts. Real estate contracts are not covered by the UCC, and employment contracts, which are for employees, that is also not covered by the UCC because they do not fit the goods definition. Which one, it has to be tangible, and second, it has to be movable from place to place. Well, let's go to the next slide and discuss a little bit more about something I want to cover with service contracts. Now here on slide number 8, we're discussing mixed contracts. Now we know, as we discussed that to cover the under the UCC, it's going to cover the sale of goods. Now goods, how we know they have to be tangible, and the second, they have to be movable. But now we're going to discuss mixed contracts. Now, a mixed contract is going to involve the sale of goods and the provision of a service. So basically, a contract that it has both. It's going to produce a good and a service. Now, generally, the courts have applied the predominant purpose test to determine when the code is going to apply to these mixed contracts. Now, under this predominant test, the courts, they're going to determine two things. Or one or the other. They're going to determine whether the predominant purpose of the contract is the service, is the redemption of the service, with goods kind of just incidentally involved in the service. So whether the service is a main purpose with some goods involved in it. That's that first question, whether it's like that, or whether the main purpose of the transaction is the sale of the goods, with labor incidentally involved, with just some labor that has to come with the sale of the good. Now, if the test says that the predominant purpose of the sale is the actual good with labor incidentally involved, then the UCC is going to control, because that's going to still be a sale of a good, which essentially it's going to fall to. Now, common law will control if the predominant test is the service. So if we're selling a good with some service involved, or some service that just needs to come with the sale of that good, then it's still going to apply with the UCC. It's still going to fall under the sale of a good. However, if the main purpose of the contract is the service with just some goods that come with it, then it's going to fall under common law, because it's mostly going to be a service contract. Okay, well, I just wanted to make sure that we all understood that, because I know we talked about sale of goods, but then a lot of times there's a lot of contracts where there's mixed contracts there, the individual, the seller, is selling a service and a good, or is selling a good with some service. Okay, well, let's go on to the next slide and talk a little bit more about this. Now we are here on slide number 9. We're still gonna just cover a little bit of some definition. I wanted you all to know before we start moving on to the next video and discussing all the details and the rules and the laws. I want you to discuss merchant. Now, Article 2 of the code, it contains special provisions that are going to apply only to transactions involving merchants. Now, a merchant is anyone who is regularly engaged in the sale of a particular good. Now, the UCC imputes a certain level of knowledge and awareness to merchants and allows their transactions to proceed in a perhaps maybe an expedited manner without all the necessary safeguards intended to cover the average consumer. So, say for instance, if there is an individual who goes into a lawnmower store and he buys or just say we go to Home Depot and Home Depot sells me a lawnmower. I go to Home Depot, I buy a lawnmower. The UCC is going to apply because there are certain consumer protections when a merchant, Home Depot, is selling to a consumer. So that's when the UCC is there, because it has a lot of consumer protection laws for a consumer like me. However, if Home Depot is selling perhaps maybe to a maintenance company that purchases 100 lawnmowers at one time, then that's when it's going to be a merchant to merchant transaction. It's going to be a more expedited sale or transaction, as well as all those consumer protections that kind of slow down the transaction are not gonna be implied or not going to be activated here, because it's a merchant to merchant transaction, not a merchant to consumer transaction. Now, the UCC is going to impute that there's some certain level of awareness and knowledge when a lawnmowing business is buying 100 lawnmowers from Home Depot. So there's different rules, or we would say less rules, because the consumer protection rules are not there from a merchant to merchant transaction. Okay, well, let's go on the next slide and keep discussing this. Now we're here in slide number 10. We're almost done with the slides. We're just gonna go do a quick overview of what we just previously discussed. Now I mentioned UCC Article 2 is going to apply to the sale of goods. Now those what goods are, they're going to be just going to be tangible, something that's physical that you can hold or and that you can have, and also they need to be movable. So it's got to be tangible and movable. And of course, other than money and investment securities, those don't count. Although those can be perhaps tangible, dollars, bills, and security stocks and things like that. Those can be tangible and movable, but those are not covered here by the UCC. UCC Article 2A also covers the leases of goods, which we did not cover very much detail here, but just let you know, Article 2 is the sale of goods and the leasing of goods. Now, in a mixed contract involving the sales and services, the UCC is gonna cover it, or it's gonna govern it or cover it if the predominant purpose, the main purpose of it, is the sale of goods with perhaps maybe a little bit of service. However, common law is gonna control with the contract if the main part of the contract is a service with some goods involved in it. But that's the main thing to know. If the predominant thing is the good, then the UCC is going to cover it. If the main part of it is the service, then common law will cover the contract, and it will not be covered by the UCC. Well, let's go to the next slide. Discuss one other quick little summary, and then from there we'll be done for today. Today's discussion is a short video. Let's go to the next slide. Now covering here the slide number 11, which will be the last slide, the last subject matter slide, but this will be a quick little summary of what we discussed in the previous slides. We had mentioned in the common law, it's going to apply to contracts where the majority of it is services, while Article 2 of the UCC is going to apply to where contracts where the majority of the contract is involving the sale of a good or goods. Thus the UCC is going to preempt or displace common law when goods are being sold. We know with the majority of us, we always discuss common law and judge-made law. However, but the UCC is always going to control when it's the sale of goods, unless agreed to otherwise by the parties. Now, among other things, Article 2, for example, of the code, it's going to relax some of those stricter common law contract requirements, such as the doctrine of consideration, which we discussed in previous chapters. Well, that's all we have here for the subject matter slides. But let's discuss this the last slide, slide 11, and then we can finish this discussion. Well, thank you. This is joining to slide number 12. Thank you guys for joining me this week, for watching this short video for week 10, chapter 13. But for next week, we'll be in week 11, and we'll be discussing chapter 14. Now, chapter 14 is going to be a continuation of sales. It's going to be sales continued, continuation of what we discussed today. Again, we discussed the UCC and the sales of goods. Next week will be week 11, chapter 14. It's going to continue on the sales and kind of pick up on where we left off this week. But thank you guys very much. For next week, please read chapter 14. I'll be posting the video. I'll also be posting the assignment for this week. Again, if you have any questions or anything, feel free to reach out to me. I'll be glad to discuss anything you guys need. Okay, well, thanks a lot for joining me this week. See you guys next week, and let me know if you guys have any questions. Thanks a lot.